Today's video sponsor is MSI and their B550 Tomahawk motherboard, a board which we've tested and found to deliver excellent VRM thermal performance. And when paired with the award-winning AMD Ryzen 5 3600 6-core 12-thread processor, makes for a great balanced option for gaming, content creation, and productivity. With lightning-fast PCIe Gen 4, 2.5 gigabits per second networking, and premium build and design quality, you can enjoy flagship-level features and performance at a price point that won't break the bank. Upgrade today and enjoy more cores and more performance via the links in the video description. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I bet you guys weren't expecting to see Monitor Steve for another week, but Tim and I have got together a bit early because, well, there's been a lot of questions about RTX 3080 related stuff relating to supply issues, performance, all kinds of things. So we put it out there to our Patreon members to ask us a few questions because we were seeing a lot of stuff in our Patreon Discord. We did have a live stream with our Patreon members a few nights ago. That was after the AIB release, wasn't it, Tim?
Yeah, that's right. We only usually do one live stream a month, but with this release period coming up, we're like, oh, may as well just throw an extra one in for the guys in the Discord. So I think they really enjoyed that, and a bunch of questions for today as well. So a lot of repeated questions that we've seen in our Discord chat and online comments over the past couple of weeks. So I think it would be good to clarify some of the things that we couldn't really include in the review so far.
Some of the more interesting stuff we'll bring to the main channel. So hopefully you guys enjoy this sort of just the casual Q&A type format. Tim and I are basically just going to have a conversation about these questions back and forth like we normally do, record it, and we'll see how it goes.
Yep.
But anyway, we'll probably get to the first question.
All right, first question, and I think this one's been asked quite a few times throughout the Discord comments, all that sort of thing, so it'll be a good one to have a bit of a discussion on. Steve, why are 1080p gains so lousy in your opinion? Is it mostly due to the fact that in that low res you can't properly load the GPU? So, what are your thoughts?
Well, for 1080p, it's hard to say exactly because there will certainly be some CPU bottlenecking or system bottlenecks happening at 1080p. That won't be the case for all games, and I'd say it's not the reason why overall, if you're looking at a large sample of games, performance at 1080p is the gains are much worse over Turing-based GPUs than you'd expect. So we certainly found that the gains at 1440p weren't nearly as impressive as 4K. So at 4K, we were looking at about, on average, 70% performance uplift, 50% at 1440p, and I'd say only low single-digit figure could account for, the CPU bottleneck rather, could account for a low single-digit of that, 20%?
Yeah.
So, and we talked about the reasons for that, Ampere being a compute-heavy architecture, and by increasing the resolution, you're just allowing it to better utilize that architecture. And we've seen that with GCN quite a bit in the past as well. It's thought to be things like driver overhead, why it didn't work as well at lower resolutions compared to high. And while that certainly could have been part of it, it's probably more to do with the compute-heavy architecture. Whereas previously we've seen Nvidia make architectures more geared towards gaming, and that's certainly not the case here. So we saw with stuff like the shaders and compute effects shaders, they're just more intense at 4K when compared to 1440p, and that's why you're better able to utilize that double FP32 architecture compared to 1440p. But what are your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, it seems like there's been a fair bit of confusion around the sort of architectural design of Ampere versus Turing versus previous generation designs, because previously a lot of what Nvidia's been doing is they just increase the SM count with each generation. So you go from your 1080 Ti to your 2080 Ti to your 3080, and people expect that, there's just going to be more SMs, which brings with it, not just an increase in the CUDA cores or the FP32 shaders, but also stuff like the TMUs, the ROPs, all the other components that go into the GPU design. Whereas with Ampere, yes, we're getting so many more CUDA cores, but that's really the only significant gain. If you look at the SM count of the 3080 versus the 2080 Ti, it's roughly the same. There's a few differences to the other parts of the design, but you're talking about mostly the same TMUs. I think there's a slight increase to ROPs. I'm not fully up to speed on the exact specifications. We can put them on screen, I guess, for you. But yeah, essentially at those lower resolutions, you're going to be more limited or more heavily utilizing things like the texture mapping units and the geometry engines of the GPU. And at 4K, you're not necessarily getting, 4 times the geometry load that you would see 4 times the shading load going from 1080p to 4K. So yeah, that's kind of explains at least a little bit of why we're seeing some architectural bottlenecks there. And that design is great for, compute stuff like, Blender rendering, all that sort of thing where you're really heavily utilizing FP32. But for gaming, it seems to only really come into its own at these really high resolutions. And if they had doubled the SM count to go with the increase in CUDA cores, increase the geometry engines, increase the ROPs, all those sort of things, then we would probably see much better scaling at those 1440p, 1080p resolutions.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be quite interesting to do a video that looks into basically this subject. How CPU bound are you? Because I know the assumption from a lot of reviewers and a lot of people is that you're simply CPU bound even with like a 10th gen 10900K or 10700K overclocked to 5.3 gigahertz. That's actually the primary bottleneck at those lower resolutions, which I don't think is the case. So it would be interesting to keep lowering the resolution and seeing if you keep getting a performance increase, which I suspect you would. And if you've got a hard CPU bottleneck, you just won't see any performance increase, like nothing, basically. So that could be something interesting to look at when we get time.
Yep.
I imagine we will, probably a few weeks down the track at this point, because we do have a lot on our plate. But yeah, that would certainly make for an interesting video. All right, Nick has a question for both Tim and myself. Firstly, okay, so it was a 2-part question, but we're only going to address the first part. Nick, you get one question. Could you do a one-off video looking at the ultra-wide performance of the Ampere cards to give us a look at the average gain over Turing at these slightly more power-sensitive resolutions? So ultra-wide benchmarks. Do you have anything you want to say about this one, Tim?
Probably not a whole lot, given you're probably going to be doing the benchmarking, but I think we've seen in the past from asking people what monitors they use that ultra-wide's still fairly niche. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it tends to be one of those things where we really want to stick to the resolutions that a lot of people are going to be gaming at. And we've also found in the past that it's a fairly good guide. Like, it's not the perfect sort of benchmarking, but if you go halfway between 1440p and 4K, you tend to get the performance of 3440 by 1440. So that's not going to be always the case, and especially with this new Ampere GPU design, it could be a little different. But I think for most ultra-wide gamers, you eventually sort of find that sweet spot where you can look at the performance at another resolution and sort of extrapolate it to your own experience. What are your thoughts on sort of doing ultra-wide?
Well, yeah, again, the benchmarks that we do, like you would have seen in the RTX 3080 review, they're not a performance guide for that particular game. Like, we're finding a spot in the game that's either highly repeatable, so the data's accurate, or it's very demanding, or whatever it may be, but it varies depending on the game and how able we are to test that game. So it's not a performance guide in that game. So you're really looking at the margins between GPU A and GPU B, not really what frame rates they're giving you. So if it's 20% faster in a certain game, then it's going to be 20% faster, roughly, depending on whether you're at, ultra wide resolution or 4K, for example. So it's more of a, it's more of a performance guide in that sense, for the margins, not necessarily the absolute performance.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
All right, Steve, we've got a question here. I noticed you didn't say much about the quiet mode BIOS in the 3080 TUF review. Did you end up testing it, and what was the thermal, fan RPM, and acoustic performance?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned it. Basically didn't test it because it doesn't change the characteristics of the GPU, so you're looking at the same clock speeds. Really all it does is lower the fan speed, which increases the temperature, so it's just a different fan profile. So it's just something you could do yourself. But from memory, it ran a bit hotter. I think it was getting up to around 66 degrees from 62, so somewhere between 66 and... Yeah, it's still... And then the fan speed, I think, dropped to about 1500 RPM. So very quiet there. You could barely hear it over your case fans, rather. So, yeah, just a slightly different fan profile, which is nice, but it's not the default setting. We generally focus on the default settings because that's what most people are going to be using. But yeah, if it changes how the GPU behaves, if it lowers clock speeds, whatever, we usually look into that briefly. So yeah, that's all it is, just a different fan profile. All right, another one here for both of us, Tim. if the rumors of 16 gigabyte 3070s and 20 gigabyte 3080s are true, do you guys expect they'll perform differently / better than the 8 gigabyte and 10 gigabyte variants respectively? I don't think they'll perform better really. It's just, it's got that more future-proof thing. We have seen in a lot of instances that right now 10 gigabytes is right on the edge for 4K gaming. And that's not to say the 3080s are going to run into problems anytime soon. We don't know, obviously, but they could. There's certainly a potential for them to run into VRAM limitations at 4K. A 20 gigabyte buffer, no chance in hell. That's certainly overkill for the foreseeable. Much of the same can be said about 16 gigabytes for a 3070. What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I think with these VRAM different cards, it really depends a lot on the pricing difference between the two models. Because we've seen in the past, AMD has done a lot of 4 gigabyte versus 8 gigabyte configurations. And it's maybe not necessarily now, but certainly back in like your 580 and 480 type generations, the value with those cards was always with the 4 gigabyte version. So it just made a lot more sense to get the cheaper one at the time because you weren't really seeing that performance difference with the 8 gig card. And then it comes, 3 or 4 years later and suddenly the 4 gigabyte card is, becoming unusable in some games at some resolutions. So it's really about tossing up between, what you'll be able to do now with the card and whether you sort of focus on the value today or whether you spend that extra amount more and have the future-proofingness or potential for future-proofing. But again, it really just does depend on the price difference. If it's $200 more to get 20 gig over 10 gig, then it's probably not going to be a card that's going to attract a lot of buyers. Whereas if it's only $50 more, then perhaps when you're talking about a $700 GPU, then it will make a lot more sense. So, yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to see how that sort of hinges and what people's conclusions among reviewers end up being. Because, I think for your cost per frame thing, it's probably not going to come out too favorable for the 20 and 16 gig models.
Yeah, it obviously depends on when they release these cards, why they release them, and all that sort of stuff, so how they plan on positioning them. So the value aspect is very hard to talk about, but if they do come in above the pricing that we've currently got, then you're absolutely right. The cost per frame stuff's not going to look great because we're not exceeding a 10 gigabyte buffer at the moment, so there'll be no change in performance. That's something to retest in a year, 2 years' time, and see what happens then. The 480 example is quite interesting because with a more entry level, at certainly mid-range at the most, with those cards, it really is all about value. So you're not too concerned about getting, back with the 4 gigabyte versus 8 gigabyte. You were better off with the 4 gigabyte card back then, unless you kept it for, right up until now. And even then, you're probably more willing to just lower textures, sacrifice a bit of texture quality, because it's really about value. Whereas with a $700 GPU, I don't think you really want to be making those kind of compromises. So in a year's time, if there's like an ultra super texture pack or something for an awesome looking game that makes it look a lot more realistic, you're not going to dial that down a notch or two to have it run perfectly on the 10 gigabyte card. You want to enjoy. So if it's say $100 more for 20 gigabytes, just throwing a random number out there, it's probably worth that if, a year down the track, you can take advantage of it, which we just don't know. So it is a bit of an unknown, but I think with the more premium products, you just want more. Make sense?
Yeah, and I think it'll as well be interesting to see how the pricing goes with the 3070, because obviously $100 more for a 3080 to get 10 to 20 gig is not as bad as, say, spending $100 more with a $500 GPU to go from 8 to 16 gig. But then again, the 3070... being a supposedly 2080 Ti performance, but with 8 gig instead of 11 gig makes it maybe more worth spending the money on the 16 gig for that card, especially if you're playing at 4K. So there's just so many interesting things that's going to play out when and if those cards come out. So we'll have to see about that one.
Okay, another question here from Hamo. With the performance hit of using ray tracing in games, and that the 30 series doesn't seem to really improve the relative performance hit, when it is enabled, what do you guys think is the situation for ray tracing moving ahead? Do you think it is more important for improving, or what do you think is more important for improving ray tracing? Optimization on the software side or better hardware, so more RT cores, for example? Sorry for the somewhat pointless questions. Just interesting to discuss how ray tracing can be improved in the future. I think it's a pretty interesting question, really.
Yeah, certainly not.
You've sort of covered that.
Yeah, certainly not a pointless question or anything like that. Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think in current games we've seen that the software side of things, they're not really utilizing too much ray tracing at the moment. There's sort of sparing use of effects using just one effect. Like, there's games like Fortnite obviously being an example that has, shadows, reflections, global illumination all enabled, but a lot of other games stick to just doing reflections or just doing shadows. And on top of that, we've seen that there's a very sparing use and lots of optimizations. Even a game like Battlefield 5, there was significant performance improvements from like the first iteration to the second iteration. They've improved lots of stuff there. So I think they're doing all they can on the optimization side because the hardware side really isn't up to scratch at the moment. And that's not to say the 3080 is a bad card for ray tracing. I talked about that in my video and from your testing. You can play games at 1440p with ray tracing and DLSS enabled, and even at 4K with 60 FPS, it runs okay. It's just that to really get it to the point where it feels like ray tracing becomes a useful feature that you're just going to turn on, you're going to take the performance hit, it really needs to be at least twice the hardware capabilities at the very, very minimum. So that I think that would mean adding more RT cores or speeding up the RT cores significantly. I'm not really sure which of those is more possible to do within the pipeline of a GPU, but yeah, there needs to be much more hardware because I think game developers really want to start using all the effects that they can, not just using one effect, but even moving towards, full ray tracing in the games, not the sort of mix of ray tracing and shading, but really going all out with this stuff. So the software seems to be well ahead of the hardware right now, and I think for ray tracing to be better, there needs to be, more or better cores.
All right, quick little question here. I just want to know how my 8700K would go with the 3080, to be honest. It'd go just fine as far as I'm concerned, as we sort of spoke of earlier. I don't think it's being CPU bottlenecked to the degree that a lot of people seem to believe it is, and that's possibly something we will investigate in a video in the not too distant future. But your 8700K is as good as any other CPU for gaming, especially if you're overclocking it. So, we've seen that the 10600K can mix it up with the 10700K and 10900K when overclocked. So, you're going to have no problems there. There isn't really a faster option, so yeah.
Okay, if you had to pay with your own hard-earned cash and were only buying a GPU for your own personal use, not because you run a massively important TechTube channel, would you buy a 3080 now or wait until the rest of the cards launch, i.e. Big Navi, 3090, 3080 Ti, etc.? So we've talked about this a little bit in some of our previous discussions on this, and I think, at least for me, I would be waiting just to get a good overview of what's on the market. Not even if you're still wanting to buy a 3080, it's just if you have all the information there, how Big Navi performs, how the 3090 stacks up, how the 3070, all those sort of things stack up. We know these are only a couple of months away, so I'd wait the couple of months, just assess the market and then go in with the buying decision. But obviously at the same time, if you're going to have to be comfortable missing out on that first batch of GPUs. They're already sold out now at this point anyway.
Exactly.
But, yeah.
We just don't know how this is going to play out. It's kind of surprising that we've heard so much about what seems to me as though it would be reserved as a refresh, but it depends on how Nvidia's planning on playing this. So they could release these cards with the bigger VRAM buffers at a higher price to fill in the gaps that we're seeing between the 3080 and 3090. There's a big pricing gap there. Those cards could come in and fill that gap. Or they could be just waiting to see what AMD does because they showed their hand first. If AMD comes out with something much better than what we're expecting, or at least something that's very competitive, and they come in at a lower price, that may force Nvidia to move these existing parts down a bit in price and then fill them back in with the cards with the higher VRAM capacity. This is all speculation, of course, but it allows them a bit of room there to counter AMD, whatever they plan on doing. I think that's maybe what they're reserving them for.
Yep.
But we'll just have to wait and see. But absolutely, if it was my money, I'd be waiting to see what happens here because, you could do a lot better. As Tim said, and as you're all well aware, you sort of have to wait anyway. So, Yeah, I wouldn't be freaking out like a lot of people are about these availability problems, and just chill out, play it cool, and see what happens.
All right, I think this is another question that is kind of on people's minds at the moment from Luca. Why is there still such a large disparity in announced price and prices in reality with the Ampere launch? With previous launches like Turing, the 2080 Ti would have been a $1,200 sale price with FE card while being $1,000 MSRP, and those sub $1,200 cards never materialized. Now we only have a $700 MSRP for the cards, and we're seeing $800 plus outside of Nvidia's own unobtainium FE cards. This is especially the case in Australia, where the FE is only made available through a raffle purchase for 1,140 AUD, and then the next cheapest cards being $1,300 to $1,400. I think there has been a few, if you were very, very lucky, there has been a few cards available from board partners that are below $800. So you're always going to have to pay a small premium for most cards. But I think there's been a few at $700 and a few at like $740, $750 sort of thing. But price hikes at the launch of a card or launch of any product happen all the time, wouldn't you say? Like CPUs, GPUs, it just happens.
It's a really bad indicator of how pricing, when it settles down, what it's going to look like. We're really hoping that those MSRP targets are hit this time. We're expecting them to be, but yeah, time will tell. But it's always just an absolute mess when these cards first come. It's really funny because this happens almost every time. We've seen it, I don't know, as far back as I can remember. And then even more recently, like the RX 480, that was a fairly affordable. It was like $250. Yep. That card's availability was terrible. And we see this a lot on the AMD side as well, which is kind of funny. But, Vega, there was sort of the cryptocurrency thing happening around the Vega 5664 time. We had the Radeon 7 launch. There wasn't very much demand there at all, but availability was absolutely terrible. We've had it with, Intel CPUs. We know they've had those 14 nanometer shortages now for years somehow. Yep. But, 10900K, you couldn't buy that thing for so long, and I think availability might still be quite spotty on that part. We saw it with Threadripper, the 3rd Gen 3. So basically when a new product comes out, availability is bad, especially now that 2020 has just been a really bad year for availability, period. So this doesn't surprise me at all. Let's just see what it looks like in a few weeks' time and sometime next month, obviously.
Yeah, and I think the 2080 Ti was really the real only card in that launch lineup that didn't really come down in price from the $1,200 that sort of came onto the market at. The 2080, for example, that was a $700 card that for quite a while was selling for over $800. Despite reviews and despite the sort of lackluster reception on that part versus the 1080 Ti. So there was a period where the 1080 Ti dropped in price, but the 2080 was still available for like $800. It just happens with GPU launches, no matter how good or bad the product is. So I think because at least because we're expecting some competition, that there won't be a situation where it'll just be $800 forever or high prices forever, and they probably will have to actually compete at the MSRP. But if they're unchallenged in price, like let's say 3090s come in at $1,800 or something ridiculous like that, then it's possible that they wouldn't come down. But again, it's too hard to say with all these sorts of launches. Just let it play out. Let it settle over the coming months, and hold your horses a little bit and buy it when the price is right.
So we have basically the same type of question, but it talks more about how our reviews would play out. So when supply starts to meet the demand of these cards, do you see the cards staying at the MSRP? So that's basically what we've already talked about. Or will a more normal price for the 3080 start to look like $800, $850? So we've talked about that. But the part I'm interested in, will future cost per frame analysis take into account prices of the actual available stock? So basically, when the price settles, if it's $800 and it's not the $700 we were promised, how does that affect things like cost per frame? And I have thought about that a bit. And I think for us, I don't know what your thoughts are, Tim, maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, but I think for us, this would be kind of us giving Nvidia a last chance on this. If we see another 2080 Ti pricing type situation where we're promised $1,000 cards, but they stay at the $1,200 MSRP, and then with the 3080, we're promised $700 cards, but then it turns out they're pretty much all $800 plus, then I think when it comes to reviewing future Nvidia GPUs, we're going to be, it's going to be going to be difficult to take them at their word on what the MSRP really is. And certainly for future content, if we see them stay at $800 plus, which I don't think is going to be the case, but if we did, then I would definitely be adjusting the cost per frame to, like what we did with the 2080 Ti. We basically ended up calling that a $1,200 card. So yeah, I think we would definitely adjust it, but it would also make future reviews difficult because, you know, the day one review, we're saying this is a great value product. It's exceptional value. Look at the cost per frame, but then that's never a thing. It's basically a lie. I hope we don't see that again. I'm sure we won't, because there's going to be a lot of backlash if we do.
Yeah, I know you've done a fair few of your reviews. You've had the MSRP cost per frame chart and then the actual price cost per frame chart. So I think you'd almost have to do in a day one review like MSRP and then sort of like an expected price where sort of you guess that based on previous launches they've all been $100 more, for example, then you're adding $100 to the price. So then even if it turns out that that's not true and it comes more down to the MSRP, at least people have both sets of data. You sort of have the advertised price, and then, you know, if it turns out that the real price is higher, then you also have that information there. That's probably, I mean, yeah, it's not a great situation. It would really be good if companies didn't lie or mislead about prices, and we don't know where that's going to happen this time, but it certainly makes it more difficult to review, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, at this point, the 2080 Ti situation's been a one-off, really. We haven't seen that in the past. We're hoping we don't see it again, but if we do, then yeah, as you say, it's going to be something we're going to have to account for in future reviews. Okay, quick question here. Will you test the FE flow-through design against the traditional design in various case configurations? So basically, the FE cards, they're meant to, well, they do exhaust some air out the rear of the card, so not all of the heat is dumped in the case. There were also concerns that the fan that pushes some of the hot air through the card pushes it up into where the CPU cooler would be located, and if you're using an air cooler, that could hurt thermals there. So I did some testing that I was planning on including in the day one review, but I wasn't sure it was conclusive enough because I was only using one case with one airflow setup. But when I compared the Asus TUF card, the TUF Gaming, with the FE model, I saw really no difference in case temperatures, and I tried with an all-in-one liquid cooler, and I tried with a Noctua air cooler. Exact same CPU temperatures on the Ryzen 9 3950X, like no difference at all after an hour of letting the system play F1 2020. So yeah, there was really no difference between the two cards. The only difference was the TUF card actually ran cooler after those tests, but the rest of the components in the case were the same. That was with a 21 degree ambient for both tests. So I don't think there's much in it there, but I didn't go reporting that as fact because it's one case with one airflow setup. So but yeah, I don't think you're going to notice too much of a difference there. This one's not so much of a question, but it just points out only 20 times better than plastic backplate. Shouldn't it be 100 times better than a plastic backplate? So that's in relation to the MSI Gaming X Trio review, where I sort of laughed at MSI for claiming that their graphene / probably mostly plastic backplate was I think, what was it? 20 times better in terms of thermal dissipation and 4 times stronger or something. I can't remember the exact claim, but basically they were making the claim that they had this amazing graphene backplate and it was so much better than a plastic backplate on a $700 graphics card. Like, what $700 graphics card has a plastic backplate? And plastic backplates are just dumb and shouldn't exist, period. So kind of a weird claim there. We really wanted to know how much better it supposedly was according to MSI compared to like the aluminium backplate we saw on the TUF Gaming. So kind of a silly one there. But yeah, I'm not sold on that graphene backplate. Basically, when you get it, like just lightly flexing it like that, it just bends massively, whereas the aluminium one's very stiff. So it certainly improves how robust the card is and how it's going to reduce PCB flex, for example, with that like basically 1 kilo slab of aluminium on it, cooling the GPU and everything else. Anyway, marketing claims. All right, DiscoNet says, comparisons against the 3080 FE too often forget to mention the size differences. For one thing, I'd put some value on the slot it would save versus the AIB models. And to point out that the AIB cards too cool better with noting at least without noting at least once that there is a 25% or more larger gives a false impression of the engineering effort. So basically saying the FE card is much more compact than these gigantic monstrosities that AIBs are producing. So he's saying, in fact, Nvidia may have done a better job, relatively speaking, not worse. I won't be buying any of these, but fair is fair, that's all. So, yeah, that's a pretty good point, really. If you want a dual slot card that's relatively compact, the FE, that's what the FE card is. I guess from our perspective, most people don't care. We did a poll recently asking if people even use the secondary PCIe slot at all, and basically 80% or thereabouts, I think it was 76% to be exact, don't. They just leave the rest of the slots unpopulated, which has certainly been my experience with computers I've built for friends and stuff like that. They pretty much never put anything in there because if you want Wi-Fi, you generally get a board with Wi-Fi. If you want, 10 gigabit LAN or whatever, generally you get a board with that. M.2 storage and all that sort of stuff now is really good. Sound cards, but they can go off the chipset, so they go right down the very bottom, so not really a concern there either. So, yeah, generally, I think people would rather just have a bigger graphics card that runs cooler than one that's more compact. But again, I sort of point out the FE card is really good for what it does, but if you're after a card that just runs cooler and quieter, then bigger is better in that regard. And for most people, there's no, whether it takes up 2.5 slots or 2 slots or 3 slots or whatever, it doesn't really matter. Would you sort of think that as well, Tim?
Yeah, I don't think most people are size limited or space limited with their PC builds. Obviously, that's not going to be the case for your RTX builds and your compact stuff, but for most people with standard cases and motherboards, whether it's 2 slots or 3 slots, whether it's long or short, it doesn't make too much of a difference. So I tend to prefer the better cooling capacity designs. But yeah, I think it's still fair to point out that yes, the FE card is smaller, so that kind of does explain some of the differences. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that one. Interesting question, this one. Brian from Tech Yes City reported that manually overclocking the Asus TUF 3080 gives better rasterization numbers but causes crashes when ray tracing is enabled. Is this something you guys encountered as well? Any thoughts on why this might be happening? Well, I can't answer this question because I actually don't have a 3080, so I'm going to pass that over to Steve. Have you seen this behavior?
Well, it depends on how far it was being overclocked, basically. I found that you could overclock the core quite far and it would appear to be stable, but then if you left it looping for quite a while, it would crash after about half an hour. So I use F1 2020 for just dialing in my overclock, and I found I could go, I think it was plus like 110 on the core, and it would load up F1. That would run for about 5 minutes, then crash the desktop, then plus 100 on the core. That would last about 10, 20, 15-ish maybe. And anyway, I got all the way down to, I think it was about plus 80, and that would survive the hour. So I only do an hour, but that's fairly comprehensive. So it depends on what you're doing to validate the overclock. So if you're sort of just overclocking it, it passes for 5 minutes, it's good. Then you do something that may be a little more demanding on the GPU and then it crashes. So yeah, the overclock that I showed will do ray tracing and everything, no dramas at all. So that's 100% stable. So I guess it just depends on how you're validating your overclock as to whether it's actually stable or not. Because you can even validate in a game like F1 2020 and then try a different game that may put a different type of load on the GPU and it'll crash there. So yeah, working out stable overclocks can be a bit tricky. It takes a lot of time to get it all dialed in. But I don't think there's anything to do with ray tracing. As I said, it may just be the game that was different, or that increases the load. But you can certainly overclock and still have stability in ray traced games. Yeah,
it definitely sounds like Brian was running his overclock right on the edge. So potentially you add a ray tracing load on top of that, uses the GPU more, and it starts crashing. But I don't think it's a situation like I've seen some people commenting where maybe the RT cores are less able to be overclocked. I think it's just the whole... Nah. I think the whole GPU just has its overclocking limits, like with any sort of overclocking situation. You just need to make sure it's stable and everything.
Yep. But if you are overclocking, then basically whatever you find most sensitive, use that for stress testing, and it'll be much easier to find where the limits of the card are. But yeah, I just found in F1 2020 it needed to be run for quite some time to see if it would pass or not.
Okay, I think there's another question that is on a lot of people's minds right now. Have you spoken to any of your industry contacts about Ampere availability or how ready partners were for release? Hardware Luck seems to think that Ampere was rushed to launch twice as fast as Turing was. To the contrary, Nvidia's own statement says they had the same volume as previous launches. Whether one or both of these is true, doesn't it seem a bit silly to expect the same demand for Ampere when it was preceded by one of Nvidia's most underwhelming launches? So lots of stuff to sort of break down in this one. I think people have been looking at the dies and the stamps that are on the dies to sort of figure out that, you know, when Turing launched in September, the dies were being manufactured in July, and then supposedly with Ampere, still got the September launch, but the dies are being manufactured in August. So there's potentially that shorter time to market there. Whether that's causing any issues, we don't know, because we don't know about their supply chain. It could make no difference whatsoever that the dies are coming, you know, a month later. Who knows? But it does seem, while we haven't spoken to a lot of industry contacts and partners, I think recently Gamers Nexus did a pretty comprehensive look into this, where they spoke to people that seem to confirm Nvidia's statement that Turing and Ampere availability was roughly the same at launch, but it's just that the demand was sky high for this launch and not like the complete opposite effectively for Turing. So yeah, I think that the last part there is really, really critical, that yes, it is a bit silly for Nvidia to have expected the demand to have been exactly the same for those two launches. I think everyone knew this was one of the biggest GPU launches ever, so probably should have expected a bit more demand, but obviously they're just trying to get the cards out as quickly as possible. What are your sort of thoughts on it?
Yeah, I don't think they were caught out by the demand. I think they knew it was going to do better than Turing. It's just they released it when they thought they had to release it. So it's all about timing. So, and as we've already said, this isn't, for us anyway, we're not sitting here going, oh my God, this is terrible. This is what happened here. This is an absolute disaster. It's like, well, it's far from ideal. I certainly understand people's frustrations who want to buy one of these cards, but this isn't new. Basically, if you are an early adopter, you risk getting burnt in many different ways. So one of them is you miss out entirely, but you could also rush in, get one, and then a few months down the track, it could turn out that wasn't a good value product or a good buy, or, you know, any number of things can happen. But basically the point is, this isn't new. Like, this was always going to happen. So we've seen it time and time and time again. So yeah, there's not much more to say.
I think that there's definitely some companies that manage launches better. So, you know, they have better prediction of how much demand they're expecting and are more willing to wait to let their supply ramp up to the stage where they can meet demand. I think, you know, for all Apple's faults, you tend to be able to buy an iPhone at launch, even though, you know, they sell millions and millions of units on the first day. You know, it's still reasonably possible to buy an iPhone, at least relative to something like a 3080. And it seems that a company like Apple is more willing to wait so that they have enough inventory before launching, and they have obviously very good supply chain as well. So I think it is a bit frustrating from the sense that with a lot of these launches, it seems like companies try and prioritize getting the product out there with no stock over ensuring that people have a good launch experience. And it's kind of gotten to the point where people are just kind of accepting it now. As we've talked about many times now, it's happened with so many launches. It's kind of just like, oh, it's another situation where this cool product comes out and there's no stock at launch. You have to wait months. And it would be great if they could improve that situation. But at the same time, do you go down a path where a few people can buy it a few months earlier and then more people can buy it later, or have a situation where just everyone's buying it later? It's kind of... It's a really hard toss-up, because in some ways it is better if a few people can get it earlier, but then do you risk annoying more of your customers? It seems like a fairly complicated situation for these companies.
Yeah, I'm sure, as I said, there's other timing-related factors in there that we're unable to account for. So there's obviously a reason why they launched it now. So whether that was to get ahead of whatever AMD was doing or that just... Yeah.
Yep.
But it's far from ideal, and I certainly understand people's frustrations. But you gave an example of Apple doing a good job there, sure, but we see this with AMD, Intel, Nvidia all the time, that they'll announce a new exciting product, people want to buy it, and they just can't. So,
yep.
Hopefully, it really all depends on if this is no longer a problem by next month, then it was sort of big fuss about nothing. But if availability is still terrible this time next month, then yeah, that's a bit of a problem. So we'll just have to wait and see on that one. All right, next question here. With the leaking of the 16GB and 20GB 3070 and 3080 respectively by Gigabyte, so that was, I think, video cards broke that story.
Yep.
Anyway, given these cards are out of stock from Nvidia, as a consumer who might have missed out on the first wave, would you be relieved that you weren't able to secure one of the 10GB model 3080s? Please know I'm not buying one. I'm thinking about people buyer remorse and all that sort of stuff. So that's about the end of that question. Yeah, it may be that by missing out now and having to wait a bit longer, which is sort of what I said at the end of my 3080 review. I said, I know a lot of you guys are going to be wanting to rush out and get one of these as soon as possible, but from what I've been hearing from retailers, there's just very limited stock, and the demand is certainly going to outweigh the levels of stock they have there. So you're probably going to have to wait anyway a bit down the track, and at that point you might as well just wait and see what AMD has, and that might be, like I said, if AMD comes out and delivers more than what we're expecting, perhaps what Nvidia's expecting, then that's maybe when they'll drop these cards with the higher VRAM capacity and they may come in at a better price. Who knows? There's a lot of unknowns there. But yeah, again, this also goes to back to the early adopter stuff that I spoke of. You can sometimes get burnt being an early adopter and just waiting an extra month or so. You may get better prices or a better deal or an entirely different product. So I think you're just better off waiting at this point and not scrambling to get one of those 3080s. Yeah,
I think it's really hard to say, as you said, whether you should be relieved or not, because you just don't know what those cards are going to come in and the pricing be like. I think it's been a while since we've seen a launch where a card is released and then a few months later the price drops or there's a significant shake-up from the one company. Usually these companies tend to fairly closely monitor the market and tend to get their launch prices fairly good. So they don't need to drop out. I mean, we've seen with like the 5700 that there was a price drop before the launch, but a month after launch, you risk annoying customers that go out and buy the first card only to realize that there's a much better value thing, just around the corner. So yeah, there's so much to play out there with that one. I certainly... I don't know. If you were happy with the 3080's value and you missed out and you had this money sitting around for ages and you were really keen on getting a new GPU, then I think you probably wouldn't be relieved about the new cards. You'd just be like, oh, I still missed out. I want that performance now. But if you're already thinking about waiting, then maybe that little bit of extra information about high VRAM capacity models maybe just, I don't know, solidifies your opinion, makes you a bit more comfortable with waiting, where you might have been had a bit more buyer's envy or buyer's remorse or whatever, or that sort of thing. So yeah, we'll see how that one plays out. But yeah, waiting tends to be the way that I think this one should be going at the moment. Yeah,
I mean, at this point in time, we're not even 1 week from release.
That's right.
Again, I understand the frustration, especially for those of you who may have sold a 2080 or a 2080 Ti and perhaps not even got the best price you could have. You might have waited a bit too long to sell that, but you may be without a graphics card right now and you really wanted to get back into gaming with something high end and you want the 3080. You're set up to buy it and you can't get one. So extremely frustrating. Certainly understand that, but we're expecting that situation to improve fairly quickly. Again, we'll just have to wait and see on that one. But as I said, we're not even a week from launch yet. So let's see what happens. And while I agree with Tim, it's very unlikely that there's going to be any massive price shakeups or anything like that so soon after launch. That stuff's very, very difficult to predict because, it depends on what AMD does and how aggressive they want to be with stuff. They may just do what we've sort of seen them do a bit of more recently with the Radeon group, with just sort of price match, not seriously undercut. We'll have to wait and see. It depends on how good their product is and what their margins are like and what they can do there. Because if they hit it out of the park, then that is going to force Nvidia to react, and that is going to upset early adopters. But again, early adopters, you get burnt. Like, no one's got any if you whinge about, Nvidia screwing you over, it's like, well, you're an early adopter. No sympathy from most people, I think, on that one. But yeah, I'm not expecting that to happen. But I don't know what to expect at this point in time. I certainly don't know what to expect from AMD. That's a massive unknown to me. And it seems like it's a massive unknown to everyone who likes to try and guess and speculate as to what's going to happen. So we'll just wait and see.
All right, Nick has got the crystal ball out for us on this one. So there is a Chinese review of the 3090 doing the rounds. It says the 3090 is 10% or less better than the 3080. So if it turns out the 3090 is really 10% or less faster in games, does that make the 3080 a better buy in your eyes now than when you reviewed it? So I don't think it would make the 3080 a better buy necessarily, but it would make the 3090 a worse buy than perhaps we were expecting. But again, this is just a sort of leaked review. We don't really know what the performance is like at this point, and even if we did, I guess we can't tell you. So, but yeah, I think that doesn't really affect what happens with other cards. It really only affects what happens with that particular card. I think the 3080 stands up as a standalone product and has its value proposition based on previous generation products, the current lineup, and in all those regards, it still looks very favorable. So I don't think if there's this worse card sitting above it, that makes the 3080 by extension look really, really good. I guess it might depend if you were sort of had $1,500 to spend and you were sort of looking at it and be like, oh, it's actually not that much better now. For me, the 3080 is the better value buy. Maybe that's more relevant with sort of 3080 versus 3070. If the 3070 exceeds expectations, then maybe you wouldn't necessarily buy the 3080. But yeah, I don't think it'll impact too much in the reviews.
Yep. Well, we're not expecting the 3090 to be that much faster than the 3080. I don't know if it's going to be 10% or less. We'll have to wait and see on that one. But in terms of cost per frame, there is no way. There's just no way. At roughly twice the price, it's going to be nowhere near twice as fast. So that alone tells you that the cost per frame is not going to be great. Of course, you're getting a lot more VRAM. It's an interesting product, basically. It really is for... Well, it's not for gamers, technically, but it's for gamers who are like, I've got this much money and I don't care and I just want the best thing and I don't care if it's only 10% better, I want the best. So it's for people with deep pockets who want a no-compromise type solution and don't care about cost per frame, don't care about value, they just want the best. And that Nvidia knows that, that's why the product exists. But Nvidia's also positioning it as sort of a content creation type product more than a gaming product. At least that's what they tell me. And it was one of the reasons why they weren't sampling the FE model, because they were worried that people were going to focus on stuff like cost per frame for the flagship part. So yeah, we'll be reviewing it.
Replacement. Like
that's what they say.
Yeah, we've had Titans in the market before, and yeah, people at the launch of these Titan cards, people always complain, being like, "Oh, it's $2,000, it's $1,200, or whatever the situation is." But again, it's not. It's like a Quadro card for some people, or even for some people, it could be seen as like a cheaper version of a workstation card, which tend to be very expensive. So yeah, it really just depends on your workload and what you're doing with that card. Obviously, Nvidia is positioning the 3080 as the card for most high-end flagship GPU buyers in the gaming market. The 3090, yeah, it's like a Titan. You need that little bit extra, and you're willing to pay for it. Kind of like like a Threadripper, super expensive Threadripper CPU. Like, most people are not going to be buying the 64-core model, especially for some workloads where the performance gap is only slightly faster than the 32-core CPU that's much cheaper. But if you really need that, you have one workload that really scales well to 64 cores, then yes, that massive price difference is worth it for you. Whereas we're going to see the same thing with 3090. If you need 24 gig of VRAM and that's the only card on the market that gives you that, specification, then yeah, you're going to be willing to pay the $1,500, or $1,400,
that's right,
whatever it is.
If the VRAM was like 12 gigabytes or what, it would have been a dumb product, really. But the fact that it has 24, that does make it a bit of a specialty item, and it's going to be extremely good value for people that need that VRAM and can take advantage of it because, yeah, it's a great value product in that sense. But for gamers, obviously not a good value product, obviously not a good buy, but it is also, the intention there is to, cater to those people with deep pockets that do not care. Like, they just don't care. So it's always funny to see those comments where people are like, oh, all the idiots that bought 2080 Ti's, how do you feel now? And it's like, well, most people that bought 2080 Ti's for $1,200 US plus, they don't care. They've got deep pockets. They just want the best. They want a no compromise. They're not looking at value. They're not concerned about a new product coming out that's better value. They just want maximum performance. And that's what a 3090 is. That's who that is targeting. Yep. So it's that simple, really. Tim and Steve, are you happy that Nvidia has officially killed SLI? Have they officially killed it? I'm not even sure. I don't keep up with SLI news.
Yeah, I think there was some news recently about how they were phasing it out in favor of different technologies to run multi-GPU type applications. I mean, even if it's officially killed now, it's kind of been dead for many years. I mean, they've been removing the connectors from progressively higher and higher end cards, are getting rid of the connectors, and game support was being bad for years and years and years. You very rarely hear about Nvidia doing any SLI optimization, so it's been dead for a while now.
You know what's interesting about SLI and what the shortcomings of it and how it died?
Yeah.
It kind of has the same problem that we're seeing with DLSS. You know what I mean? Like, it's entirely dependent on software support.
Yeah, that's right.
From the game developers. And, well, again, like SLI kind of a lot like DLSS. It was an awesome way for improving performance. Now, with SLI, you had to invest in a whole nother card, so you were doubling your investment. Whereas with DLSS, it's kind of a well, it is really a free add-on, I suppose, to the performance you'd be getting otherwise. So DLSS is a better value proposition, let's say, but they both have that game developer limitation. And we've seen, well, DLSS 2.0, I think you and I both think it's quite a fantastic technology and it works very well now. The only limitation there, again, is the game support list. And I've seen a lot of people say, oh, your DLSS 2.0 is so good now, it's a key selling point. I don't know why you're pushing it more or why you're not pushing it more. And the answer to that is yeah, again, we've said all these things, but it's the game support list. Like, how many games currently support DLSS 2.0, and then how many are going to support it in the future? And especially upon release, like a good implementation upon release, not 6 months after the game comes out or something like that. I don't see that situation improving for DLSS. I really don't. I still think it's going to be that thing that's in a limited set of games. And yeah, it might be in some major titles here and there, but not everyone who buys an RTX 3080 wants to play that particular major title or whatever it may be. So kind of interesting.
I tend to think of all these technologies as, DLSS in particular, as kind of, it's a way in for that technology to eventually become standardized. So I think Nvidia deserves a lot of credit for showing the world that, especially with DLSS 2.0, that they can have an AI-enhanced upscaling technique, that it is possible. And the only way that it's ever going to get significant game support is if it becomes like a DirectX feature or something along those lines, where, Microsoft or, maybe it's in Vulkan or whatever the situation is, but there's some sort of API that developers can harness to do AI upscaling. And so that's where that technology is really headed. NVIDIA's going to come out with like a DLSS. They'll be like, hey guys, this is a thing that we can do on GPUs now. Then you'd expect like AMD and Intel to come out at some point with their own AI upscaling technology. And then further and further down the line, that's going to eventually get standardized into something. And
so you're predicting, sorry to interrupt, you're predicting it's going to be like a G-Sync type evolution.
Yeah, sort of like G-Sync, where one company comes out, the other company responds, and then over time we start to see effectively become a standard feature across games, integrating to DirectX, all that sort of thing. And it really has to start somewhere. And again, full credit to NVIDIA for sort of being the first to market with this sort of thing. But yeah, over time, I would expect that if it's a really compelling feature, like any compelling feature in graphics, that it will become part of APIs and that sort of thing. We even saw it with Mantle, AMD. Remember when AMD released Mantle way back with like the was it the 200 series launch? Is sort of that low level API thing. And they were like, we're first with Mantle, like with Battlefield 4 or whatever it was at the time, or Battlefield 3, whichever game it was. They're like, okay, we've got this low level API thing happening. Then eventually Microsoft comes out and is like, okay, DirectX 12 is doing a lot of this stuff, and then Mantle effectively becomes Vulkan as well. So I think that is where a lot of these cool technologies will go over time. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one with considering we've fully sidetracked ourselves from the SLI question. I think SLI, that's going to die away, but as we get to potentially multi-die GPU designs, we're going to start to see more of a resurgence of techniques that utilize like multiple GPUs. Maybe the GPUs, you don't need two separate cards with separate memory or anything, but there's going to be, games are going to need to perhaps be optimized again for these sort of newer multi-GPU configurations that we're going to be getting. Because we can't keep scaling beyond we can't get 1,000 square millimeter dies. It's just...
No, I think that would go... No, that wouldn't be anything that relies on software developers is just never going to work. This would be more like your chiplet design that you see on Ryzen.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's where SLI is going to go.
Yeah, it won't require software intervention for it to actually work. I'm going to hijack this again because I had a thought while we were talking about all this. So we've sort of acknowledged, and I know you have in the past, that we've got these tensor cores and all that sort of stuff because Nvidia want to go with a single architecture. It's more cost effective. The money's sort of in the data center, the AI, all that kind of stuff. So we're getting with Turing, we've got the tensor cores, we've got all that because that just filtered down from the data center type architecture, same sort of architecture.
Yep.
As essentially we've talked about this before, and you were sort of saying that stuff like DLSS, they had to think of a way to sort of pitch this to gamers. You've got these big dies that are expensive. They've got tensor cores. Cool, what do tensor cores do? Oh, they do this AI upscaling DLSS thing. So we got that. And that takes up, I can't remember what the estimates were now. We did all this ages ago. It was a fairly sizable percentage of the die is taken up by this tensor core RT stuff. Can't remember the percentage now. I probably shouldn't throw a number out there, but say it was 30% or something like that. I honestly can't remember what it was with the 2080 Ti. So what are we seeing in terms of performance boosts when DLSS works well at like 4K with the 3080? What was the percentage increase? You just covered all of this.
It can, again, it really depends on the game and the frame rate. So I think we saw in like Death Stranding, for example, it was like, 30%?
That's what I was going to say, 30, 40% at best.
In Control, it could be a lot more. So
yeah,
again, it really depends on the sort of...
Well, just off the cuff here, all I was going with was sort of transferring from this SLI conversation was, I wonder if they made a gaming-focused architecture, they didn't jam-pack it with these tensor cores, and they actually increased the SM count, whether we'd get that DLSS size improvement across all games without actually needing DLSS.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that would be true. I think as well, it's potentially a situation where using or having this entire tensor core array to do DLSS is perhaps not as efficient as having like just an accelerator on the card somewhere. Like it doesn't even need to be in the die. Like it could be literally like a separate chip on the board that does AI acceleration. Because we've seen that some TVs from like LG and other brands, for example, have upscaling abilities built into their entire TV, and that can do very impressive upscaling. Maybe not as good as DLSS. I haven't really looked into it too much, but some people do rave about the upscaling abilities of these TVs from like 1080p to 4K. So, it is possible that the better solution is, having this die that has no tensor cores on it, but has maybe like a small SoC on it that does this upscaling, or potentially a dedicated chip or whatever. I think that is going to be more where that technology could go in the future. And then potentially have your standard, as I said, DirectX APIs that, the GPU figures out a way to do the DirectX APIs based on the hardware that it has. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Potentially that's a better way to go about it. But then we don't know whether developers can harness the tensor cores for their games in a better way. because they've hardly been on the market in a gaming architecture as well. So it is possible that a developer that's really focused on optimizing for, all the stuff that's on a GPU could use some of the low-level stuff that a Tensor Core does. We just haven't seen that yet. So it's really... I don't think it's a good... That. Yeah, I don't think it's the best design, but certainly there's a lot of potential there for things to happen. But again, it's about optimizing for selling products across a wide range of markets and needing this one design that can go right up to the high end of compute cards and accelerators that they can sell for tens of thousands of dollars, and then scale that right down to GPUs. So, yeah, it's an interesting one because I think AMD will also be supporting, I would imagine, a lot of low-level processing features with their new architecture. So it'll be interesting to see how they approach it and whether they go with Tensor Cores or Tensor Core equivalents, or whether they can do that sort of processing in other ways on their GPU. There's potentially more efficient ways to do it. It's just, ways that companies can design products. We'll have to see how that one goes. SLI's dead, though.
Yes. Well, I'm not upset about that at all because, as I said, it just didn't get the support that was required for it to be utilized to a degree that made sense. But when it was utilized well, we saw really good scaling. And, 80% performance boosts, they weren't out of the realm of possibility, and when you get that at a 4K resolution, that's just massive.
Yeah.
So
didn't it become more difficult for SLI once more games moved to low-level APIs? Like SLI was primarily like a DirectX 11 and earlier type thing, and then multi-GPU became more difficult on DX12.
Possibly more difficult to program for, but it was more effective.
It was more effective.
Yeah. So anyway. It hasn't been a thing for a while as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah. Okay, well, I think that'll do it for Patreon RTX 3080 discussion. We had quite a few interesting questions there that Tim and I worked through, but we have a lot more content to work on now, so we better go do that. Of course, we have the RTX 3090 coming up in a few days' time. Before then, there's some AMD versus Intel CPU testing I want to do. There's a lot more of that I want to do, but there's at least one video that'll get us started. A bit of a look into PCI Express 4.0, 3.0 beyond what we did in the day one review. What else have we got, Tim? There's quite a few other things coming up, but
that's most of the stuff in the next couple of days through to the
that's probably the next couple of days.
Yeah.
After that, I want to do some GPU, CPU scaling kind of stuff by including the 3080. Then we'll probably look at that CPU bottleneck discussion, do some testing there to see to what degree.
Really interesting.
Yeah, that's something I'm really keen on doing. So that might happen, before some of the other stuff. But anyway, there's plenty of things for us to do, so I do need to get back to testing. And Tim will just, he'll get back to putting his feet up and relaxing.
Oh, it's going to be so nice.
Well, I do all the heavy lifting. No, Tim will have plenty of things coming up. Of course, he's got monitor reviews coming and probably a news corner segment at some point in time.
Yeah, game optimizations, all that sort of thing. There's more news coming up. So, plenty of stuff to cover. And, of course, big shout out to our Patreon members who we got all these questions from for this little impromptu sort of Q&A session. So, it's really great to get their feedback on some of our reviews in our Discord community. If you want to sign up, there will be links in the description, all that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and about this time next week, we'll be doing a Patreon live stream for our Patreon members. So if you're interested in that, the link for our Patreon account is in the video description. You can sign up there. A few cool perks. We do Q&As, behind-the-scenes videos. There's our awesome Discord chat. So you can often find Tim and myself in there chatting with the Patreon members. So if you're interested, check it out. But other than that, I think that's done for this extremely short video that I'm sure didn't run massively over time.
Yeah, so we originally thought, let's get in this. We'll do this quick 30-minute video. We'll get through these questions. People have their answers nice and short. And my audio recorder is saying we've been here for 75 minutes. So we'll see what the final length of this video ends up as. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching it through to the end. Good job, 20% Club. If this ends up being like an hour-long video, you've done a really stellar job improving our watch time. So thank you for that. And we'll see you in the next one, I guess. Anything else to say?
Nothing other than I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
I'll see you again next time.